breaking this morning, alarms raised after a mid-air scare involving a Russian military jet. A very close call, putting a passenger plane at risk. The latest sign of that high-stakes tension growing between Russia and the West. ABC's Terry Moran on how it happened.
Russian military jets like these have been probing deeper and deeper into NATO airspace over Europe in recent months, and yesterday, a near disaster. About 11:15 a.m. local time, a Scandinavian Airlines flight over the Baltic Sea gets an urgent warning from Swedish air traffic control.
1755, initial stop climb level 220, it's due to unidentified traffic in the area.
That unidentified traffic, a Russian military jet flying with its transponder switched off, making it almost invisible to commercial traffic. The Scandinavian Airlines pilots can't see the Russian in the haze, and seconds later, a mid-air collision is just averted.
Okay, it looks like you paused behind him. Hope so.
Swedish officials reacted with fury, the defense minister declaring, "This is serious, this is inappropriate, this is outright dangerous when you turn off the transponder." And it's part of a grimly relentless pattern. These amazing pictures show a close encounter less than 100 feet between NATO interceptors and Russian jets over the Baltic Sea just last week. And in October, this grainy photo and advanced sonar data sent the Swedish Navy scrambling to scour the waters off Stockholm, searching for a covert Russian sub, but it apparently slipped away. The Russians deny everything, including yesterday's incident, but the Swedes and NATO aren't buying it. The Swedes say Russia even conducted a practice bombing run over Stockholm last year. It's all part of Moscow's message to Europe and the U.S. We're back, and we can pierce your defenses. Martha?
Thanks, Terry. That does indeed sound dangerous. Let's take this on now with our ABC contributor and former State Department official, Steve Ganyard. Steve is also a former Marine Corps fighter pilot, so let's start from that vantage point. Steve, how dangerous was this?
It's very dangerous, Martha. Anytime you're flying airplanes without the transponder on in very crowded commercial airspace, it's dangerous because air traffic controllers on the ground can't see heading, altitude, airspeed. And you remember in the previous incident, we came within 300 feet of a Russian airplane and another SAS aircraft. So it's very dangerous.
There have been a lot of these intercepts lately. There was a Dutch F-16 that intercepted a Russian plane just a short time ago. Take us through that and what was happening there.
We're seeing an unprecedented number of sorties coming out of Russia. Really, it's back to the future. It's the same number of sorties we really saw during the Cold War. And so you've got to launch airplanes out of NATO bases to go up, take a look at these airplanes, ID them, escort them out.
And they fly just right next to the airplane.
Fly right up next to the airport. We saw a terrific video of that. So it really back to the future.
But all of this brings us back to the tension in Ukraine. So why do they send the jets there, and what does this do to add to that tension?
Mr. Putin's doing the best he can and playing a weak hand. So by going up in the Baltics and creating tension up in the Baltics, he does two things. He deflects public opinion up towards that part of the world. He pins down NATO air forces up in the Baltics, while meantime he continues to build this greater Russia, build that land bridge to Crimea in the Ukraine.
Well, it also seems like an incredibly dangerous time going forward. It's a very bad time for Russia. They're in economic crisis. So what's your prediction going forward? What do we have to do?
It is a dangerous time. The ruble has tanked 40%. If the Russian economy isn't in a recession, it soon will be. The Russian economy is totally dependent for revenues on oil, which have dropped 40%. Sanctions are biting. And so this is a very dangerous time. Russia is wounded. And we could see Mr. Putin do something that would jack the price of oil up by manufacturing some sort of an incident somewhere else. And if he were going to do that, the Baltics would be a good place to start.
Just one more thing to keep our eye on. Thanks very much for joining us, Steve.
Well, Swedish defence officials are describing this as a fairly serious incident involving a commercial airliner and a Russian military plane. Sweden's Air Force chief saying that the Russian aircraft, later identified as an intelligence plane, nearly collided with the passenger jet in international airspace to the south of Sweden on December the 12th. He said the transponders on the Russian aircraft, which make it visible to commercial radar, had been switched off, describing that move as dangerous and inappropriate. Well, in recent months, Russia has been dramatically expanding its military presence, particularly in the skies over the Baltic Sea, prompting comparisons with the Cold War and concerns about possible mid-air collisions. On this occasion, though, Russian officials are rejecting the allegations of a near miss. The Defense Ministry here in Moscow saying the flight was made in strict compliance with international airspace rules, and that the distance between the military aircraft and the passenger jet was more than 70 kilometres, nearly 44 miles. Nevertheless, after the downing of a Malaysian airliner over eastern Ukraine in July, there is particular sensitivity to the idea of civilian aircraft becoming victims of the growing tension between Russia and the West. Matthew Chance, CNN Moscow.
Another Russian plane came way too close, hitting a commercial flight, according to officials in Sweden. Of course, Russia denies it. Swedish military officials claim it happened on Friday above the Baltic Sea. They say here's how it went down. The Russian plane's transponders were turned off, meaning commercial radar couldn't detect it. Back in March, Swedish officials said that a Russian plane came within 300 feet of a commercial flight from Denmark. Meantime, there's word now that Russia is still stocking up on military weapons and equipment, even though officials there predict that this country is headed for a recession next year. Swedish researchers say Russian defense companies saw a 20% increase in sales last year, even though sales dropped by 2% worldwide. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that he plans to spend $700 billion over the next 10 years to bring his military up to date. Let's bring in Adam Morelli. He's a former State Department spokesman who has also served as ambassador to Bahrain. Mr. Ambassador, thank you. Good to see you again.
Thank you, sir.
Where the heck is he going to get $700 billion?
Well, he's got the world's largest oil and gas reserves, so that's going to continue.
Prices are down there, Mr. Ambassador.
Sure, but then you can still buy a lot of weapons with even with the price at under $70. But obviously, the Russian people are going to suffer. But the point is this, sir, that Russia feels threatened, and what we're seeing is them practicing the strategy of the best defense is a good offense. And they're telling the West and they're telling the world that you mess with us at your peril.
How should we be reacting to this? And by we, I mean the rest of the world.
Well, I think what you're seeing with NATO and Europe and the United States is the right response, which is not to back down, but not to unnecessarily provoke. I mean, we often use the term bear to describe Russia. You don't want to corner a bear because they'll strike out. But the fact of the matter is, since the crisis with Ukraine began over 8 months ago, you've seen a general hardening of positions of France and of Germany, traditionally the more accommodationist countries. I think what that tells you is there is a consensus in the West and in Europe that the only way to deal with Russia is to deal firmly and with principle. And that's why we're seeing the sanctions, that's why we're seeing upgrades of NATO weapons, upgrades of NATO defensive posture in Europe, and it's going to continue.
Is it your sense that he's trying to put together pieces of the old Soviet Union? And if so, do you see a way that he could be stopped?
Yeah, I think there's a pattern here. In 2008, Georgia talked about joining NATO. Mm-hmm. And in the same year, Russia invaded Georgia, and they hived off two parts of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Now those what were parts of Georgia are now parts of Russia. Same thing they did with Ukraine in the Crimea, and now in eastern Ukraine. What that tells you is when countries on Russia's borders that used to be part of Russia become too close to the West, Russia sees that as a threat to its national security and its borders, and it will take actions to defend them. So what's the solution? The solution, I think, is, number one, not to back down. Number two, to provide sufficient security guarantees or security promises to Russia that they don't need to worry. But that's a hard sell to this president. One final point, sir.
Go ahead. Yes, sure, please.
I would say that we talk a lot about ISIS. There are those who argue that Russia is a greater threat to the West than ISIS is. Why? Because you have a sovereign country unilaterally redrawing the borders of other sovereign states. That is a very destabilizing thing, much more destabilizing than religious extremists in failed states.
Former Ambassador Adam Morelli, it's nice to see you again. Thank you.